Welcome to History for Snooze. Every chapter of history is more than battles and politics. It is the quiet rhythm of daily life, the simple routines and struggles of ordinary people. In colonial America, life was not only about founding fathers or great events, but also about farmers, craftsmen, women, and children who built their days from dawn to dusk. Tonight, we step gently into that world. Imagine wooden houses with smoke rising from stone hearths, fields stretching under the sun, and villages where neighbors gathered at wells or in small churches. Life was often hard, marked by labor, illness, and uncertainty, but also filled with moments of laughter, hope, and resilience. In these stories, we find the true heartbeat of early America, the meals prepared over open fires, the tools shaped by hand, the songs and prayers that carried people through both hardship and celebration. So, as you listen, picture the creak of wagon wheels on dirt roads, the voices of children playing in the distance, and the flicker of lanterns in the evening dark. Here, in the ordinary, history comes alive. Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your small support keeps these gentle journeys alive. And in the comments, share where you're listening from. It always brings joy to know how far these stories travel. Now, close your eyes and let us wander together into the everyday lives of people in colonial America, where history is not only written in great events, but also in the quiet strength of those who lived it. The story of colonial America is far more complex and nuanced than the simplified narratives often taught in schools. From the establishment of Jamestown in 1607 to the Declaration of Independence in 1776, nearly 170 years of colonial experience shaped the foundations of what would become the United States. During this period, millions of people from diverse backgrounds, European settlers, enslaved Africans, and indigenous populations, created a unique society that blended Old World traditions with New World innovations. Understanding how people actually lived during this era requires looking beyond the political events and famous figures to examine the daily experiences of ordinary colonists. Their lives were shaped by geography, climate, economic opportunities, social hierarchies, religious beliefs, and the constant challenges of survival in a developing frontier society. This examination reveals a colonial America that was simultaneously harsh and hopeful, restrictive and revolutionary, traditional and transformative. The colonial period was characterized by remarkable diversity. The 13 colonies that would eventually form the United States were not uniform in their development, culture, or way of life. New England's Puritan communities differed dramatically from the plantation societies of the South, while the middle colonies developed their own distinct character. Urban centers like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia offered different opportunities and challenges than rural farming communities or frontier settlements. This comprehensive examination of colonial life will explore the physical realities of daily existence, the social structures that govern behavior, the economic activities that sustained communities, and the cultural practices that gave meaning to colonial life. By understanding these elements, we can better appreciate both the achievements and struggles of the people who laid the groundwork for American society. Geographic diversity and its impact. Colonial America stretched along the eastern seaboard from present-day Maine to Georgia, encompassing a variety of geographical regions that profoundly influenced how colonists lived. The New England colonies faced harsh winters and rocky soil that limited agricultural options but provided abundant forests and waterways. The middle colonies enjoyed more temperate climates and fertile river valleys that supported diverse farming. The southern colonies benefited from warm climates and rich soil ideal for cash crops but also faced challenges from tropical diseases and extreme heat. These geographical differences created distinct regional economies and lifestyles. New Englanders turned to fishing, shipbuilding, and small-scale farming, while Southerners developed plantation agriculture based on tobacco, rice, and eventually cotton. The middle colonies became known as the breadbasket for their grain production and also developed significant commercial and manufacturing activities. Early settlement challenges. The first colonists faced enormous challenges in establishing viable communities. Many of the earliest settlements failed entirely, and even successful ones experienced high mortality rates in their first years. Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement, lost over 80% of its population in its first decade due to disease, starvation, and conflicts with indigenous peoples. Colonists had to learn new agricultural techniques, adapt to unfamiliar climates, and deal with isolation from European supply lines. They often relied on indigenous peoples for survival knowledge, learning about native crops like corn, beans, and squash that became staples of colonial agriculture. However, relationships with indigenous populations were complex and often deteriorated into violent conflicts as colonial settlements expanded. Housing and architecture. Colonial housing evolved significantly over the 170-year period, reflecting both practical needs and cultural preferences. Early shelters were often temporary structures, dugouts carved into hillsides, simple lean-tos, or crude log cabins. These provided basic protection while colonists cleared land and gathered resources for more permanent dwellings. As settlements became established, colonists built more substantial homes using local materials and traditional European techniques adapted to American conditions. In New England, the typical house was a timber frame structure with clapboard siding and a steep roof to shed snow. These homes were often expanded over time, with additions creating the characteristic saltbox shape. Southern colonists initially built similar structures but gradually adapted to the warmer climate by raising houses off the ground for ventilation, adding wide porches for shade, and using different window configurations to promote air circulation. The grandest Southern homes, built by wealthy planters, featured impressive Georgian architecture with symmetrical facades, central hallways, and elaborate decorative elements. Interior layouts reflected both European traditions and American practicalities. Most colonial homes featured a central hall or keeping room that served multiple functions: cooking, eating, working, and socializing. Separate bedrooms were a luxury found only in larger homes. Most families shared sleeping spaces, with children often sleeping in lofts or trundle beds. Furniture was initially scarce and precious, often brought from Europe or crafted by local artisans. Colonial furniture makers developed distinctive American styles, combining European techniques with local woods like pine, maple, and walnut. By the mid-18th century, wealthy colonists could acquire sophisticated furniture that rivaled European pieces in quality and style. Town planning and community layout. Colonial towns developed according to different models depending on their origins and purposes. New England towns often followed a nucleated pattern, with houses clustered around a central common or green that served as pasture land and a gathering place. The meeting house, serving both religious and governmental functions, typically occupied a prominent position, emphasizing the community's religious foundation. Many New England towns were planned communities, established by groups of families who received grants of land from colonial governments. These founders, often called proprietors, would survey the territory, establish town boundaries, allocate house lots and farming plots, and create rules for community governance. This system created relatively egalitarian communities where most families owned their land and participated in local decision-making. Southern towns developed differently, often growing around ports, courthouses, or large plantations. The plantation system created a more dispersed settlement pattern, with wealthy planters building grand houses on large estates and smaller farmers scattered throughout the countryside. Towns remained smaller and less numerous than in New England, serving primarily as commercial and administrative centers. The middle colonies combined elements of both patterns. Cities like New York and Philadelphia became major commercial centers with diverse populations and sophisticated urban amenities. Rural areas featured both nucleated towns and dispersed farms, reflecting the region's cultural diversity and economic opportunities. Transportation and communication. Colonial transportation was slow, difficult, and expensive, profoundly affecting how people lived and worked. Most colonists rarely traveled far from their birthplaces, and news could take weeks or months to spread across the colonies. Roads were often little more than cleared paths through forests, barely passable in good weather and completely impassable during winter or heavy rains. Water transportation was more reliable where possible. Rivers served as natural highways, and coastal shipping connected port towns. Colonists developed various watercraft adapted to local conditions, from small fishing boats to large merchant vessels capable of Atlantic crossings. The construction and maintenance of bridges and ferries became important community projects that facilitated commerce and communication. As the colonial period progressed, transportation infrastructure gradually improved. Colonial governments and private investors built better roads, established regular postal services, and created networks of inns and taverns to support travelers. By the mid-18th century, stagecoach lines connected major cities, making travel somewhat more predictable and comfortable. The improvement in transportation and communication had profound effects on colonial society. It facilitated trade, allowed for the spread of ideas and information, enabled the development of colonial-wide markets, and ultimately helped create the sense of common identity that would prove crucial during the Revolutionary period. The rhythm of daily life. Colonial life followed patterns dictated by natural cycles, seasonal changes, and religious observances. Most colonists lived according to the rhythms of agriculture, rising with the sun and retiring at dark. The availability of artificial light was limited and expensive, so most activities were conducted during daylight hours. A typical day began before sunrise with the lighting of fires and the beginning of household chores. Women would start cooking breakfast, often consisting of porridge, bread, and preserved meats. Men would tend to livestock, check crops, or prepare for the day's work. Children had responsibilities appropriate to their age, from feeding chickens to helping with food preparation. Seasonal variations significantly affected daily routines. Spring brought planting activities that required long hours in the fields. Summer meant tending crops, preserving foods, and preparing for harvest. Fall was the busiest time, with harvesting, food preservation, and preparation for winter consuming most of the family's energy. Winter provided a relative respite from agricultural work but brought its own challenges of staying warm, conserving food supplies, and maintaining equipment. Religious observances also structured colonial life. The Sabbath was strictly observed in most communities, with elaborate preparations on Saturday to avoid work on Sunday. Religious holidays and special observances provided breaks from routine work and opportunities for community gathering and celebration. Family structure and relationships. Colonial families were typically larger than modern families, though exact sizes varied by region, social class, and time period. Families with 6 to 10 children were common, though high infant and childhood mortality rates meant that many children did not survive to adulthood. Life expectancy was shorter than today, So many families were disrupted by the death of parents, leading to complex arrangements involving step-parents, guardians, and extended family members. Marriage patterns reflected both practical and romantic considerations. Most marriages were arranged or at least heavily influenced by parents, who considered economic factors, social standing, and religious compatibility. However, romantic love was not entirely absent from colonial marriages, and many couples developed deep affectional bonds over time. Gender roles were clearly defined and strictly maintained. Men were expected to provide economic support and represent the family in legal and political matters. Women were responsible for household management, child rearing, food preparation, and textile production. However, these roles were more flexible in practice than in theory, especially on the frontier where survival often required both sexes to perform whatever tasks were necessary. Children's lives were shaped by their social class and family circumstances. Wealthy children might receive formal education and have leisure time for play and exploration. Children from poorer families typically began working at young ages, contributing to family survival through various tasks. Regardless of social class, children were expected to show respect and obedience to parents and other adults. The concept of childhood as we understand it today did not exist in colonial America. Children were viewed as small adults who needed to learn practical skills and moral behavior as quickly as possible. However, colonial parents were not without affection for their children, and many family letters and diaries reveal deep emotional bonds between parents and children. Food and cooking. Food played a central role in colonial life, both as sustenance and as a marker of social status. The colonial diet was heavily influenced by what could be grown, caught, or preserved locally, though wealthy families could afford imported luxuries like sugar, spices, and tea. Corn was the most important staple crop throughout the colonies, adapted from indigenous agricultural practices. It could be ground into meal for bread and porridge, eaten fresh, or used to feed livestock. Wheat became increasingly important in areas with suitable soil and climate, particularly in the middle colonies. Other important crops included beans, squash, turnips, cabbage, and various herbs and vegetables. Meat came from both domestic animals and hunting. Pork was the most common meat, as pigs were easy to raise and could forage for themselves. Beef was less common, as cattle were more valuable for dairy products and labor. Poultry provided both meat and eggs, while wild game supplemented domestic sources. Coastal areas relied heavily on fish and shellfish, which could be caught locally and preserved for winter consumption. Food preservation was crucial for survival, especially during winter months. Colonists used various techniques including salting, smoking, drying, and pickling to preserve meats and vegetables. Root cellars provided cool storage for vegetables and preserved foods. Dairy products were preserved through churning butter and making cheese. Cooking methods were limited by available technology and fuel sources. Most cooking was done over open fires in large fireplaces, using iron pots and pans. Baking required either brick ovens, a luxury found mainly in established communities, or Dutch ovens that could be surrounded by coals. The preparation of meals was labor-intensive and time-consuming, requiring constant attention to maintain proper heat and prevent burning. Meals were typically simple but hearty. Breakfast might consist of porridge, bread, and beer or milk. The main meal of the day was dinner, served at midday, featuring meat or fish with vegetables and bread. Supper was usually a lighter meal of leftovers or simple dishes like soup or porridge. Wealthy families enjoyed more varied and elaborate meals, including imported delicacies and more sophisticated preparation methods. They might have separate kitchens, specialized cooking equipment, and servants to handle food preparation. However, even wealthy colonial families ate relatively simple foods by modern standards, and their diets were still largely determined by seasonal availability and local production. Clothing and textiles. Clothing in colonial America reflected both practical needs and social distinctions. Most colonists wore clothing made from locally produced materials, primarily wool, linen, and leather. Cotton was not widely cultivated in North America until the late colonial period, and silk was an expensive imported luxury. The production of textiles was a major household activity, particularly for women. They raised sheep for wool, grew flax for linen, and processed these materials into thread and cloth. Spinning wheels and looms were essential household equipment, and textile production consumed countless hours of women's time. Clothing styles generally followed European fashions but were adapted for colonial conditions and available materials. Men typically wore breeches, shirts, waistcoats, and coats, with variations in quality and decoration depending on social status. Women wore shifts, undergarments, stays, corsets, petticoats, and gowns, with aprons for work activities. Children's clothing was usually simplified versions of adult styles. Very young children of both sexes wore similar gowns and caps, with boys transitioning to breeches at around age 5 or 6. Children's clothing was often passed down through families and patched or altered as needed. The quality and style of clothing served as important social indicators. Wealthy colonists could afford fine fabrics, elaborate decorations, and the latest fashions imported from Europe. Sumptuary laws in some colonies attempted to regulate dress according to social class, prohibiting lower-class individuals from wearing certain fabrics or decorations. Color in colonial clothing came from natural dyes, often produced domestically from local plants and minerals. Common colors included browns, grays, and blues, with brighter colors like red and yellow being more expensive and therefore associated with higher social status. Footwear was typically made from leather by local cobblers or imported from Europe. Shoes were expensive and often shared among family members. Many colonists went barefoot during warm weather, especially children and those engaged in agricultural work. Clothing maintenance was an important aspect of household management. Garments were carefully cleaned, mended, and altered to extend their useful life. Buttons, buckles, and other hardware were valuable and often removed from worn-out garments to be reused on new ones. Household management and technology. Colonial households were complex economic units that produced many of their own necessities while also participating in larger commercial networks. Women typically managed household production, overseeing activities like textile production, food preservation, soap making, candle making, brewing, and gardening. The technology available to colonial households was relatively simple but required considerable skill to use effectively. Spinning wheels, looms, butter churns, and various kitchen implements were the most sophisticated pieces of equipment in most homes. Wealthy families might own clocks, scientific instruments, or imported luxury items, but most colonists relied on traditional tools and techniques. Lighting was provided primarily by candles made from tallow, animal fat, or beeswax, though rush lights, reeds soaked in fat, were used by poorer families. Oil lamps burning whale oil or other fats provided brighter light but were more expensive. Most activities that required good lighting were scheduled during daylight hours. Heating was provided by fireplaces, which were also used for cooking. Firewood was the primary fuel throughout most of the colonial period, though coal became available in some areas by the late colonial period. The maintenance of fires required constant attention, and families often shared beds or sleeping rooms to conserve heat during cold weather. Water supply varied greatly depending on location and community development. Rural families often relied on wells, springs, or nearby streams. Urban areas gradually developed more sophisticated water systems, including public wells and, in the largest cities, rudimentary distribution systems. Water quality was often poor, leading many colonists to prefer beer or other alcoholic beverages for daily consumption. Waste disposal was a significant challenge, particularly in urban areas. Human waste was typically disposed of in outhouses or chamber pots that were emptied into designated areas. Garbage was often thrown into streets or yards, where it was consumed by pigs and other animals. These practices led to sanitation problems that contributed to disease outbreaks. The colonial social pyramid. Colonial American society was characterized by distinct social hierarchies that influenced every aspect of daily life. These hierarchies were based on multiple factors including wealth, occupation, race, gender, religion, and family background. While there was more social mobility than in European societies, clear distinctions existed between different social groups. At the top of the social hierarchy were the colonial elites, wealthy merchants, large landowners, and prominent professionals. These families often traced their wealth to early successful ventures in trade, land speculation, or plantation agriculture. They lived in grand houses, wore fine clothing, owned numerous servants and slaves, and dominated colonial politics and social institutions. The middle classes included prosperous farmers, skilled artisans, shopkeepers, and professionals like lawyers and clergymen. These families owned property, employed some servants, and participated actively in community affairs. They aspired to emulate the lifestyles of the elite while maintaining their own distinct cultural values and practices. The lower classes comprised small farmers, laborers, servants, and urban workers. These individuals and families often struggled for economic security and had limited political rights. However, they were not uniform in their circumstances, and many maintained hope for economic advancement through hard work, land ownership, or business success. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were enslaved Africans and their descendants, who had no legal rights and were considered property. Indentured servants occupied a somewhat higher position, as their bondage was temporary, but they faced significant restrictions and hardships during their terms of service. Slavery and bound labor. Slavery became a fundamental institution in colonial America, particularly in the southern colonies where plantation agriculture created a high demand for labor. The first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, and by the time of the Revolution, enslaved people comprised about 20% of the total colonial population. The experiences of enslaved people varied significantly depending on their location, the type of work they performed, and the attitudes of their owners. Plantation slaves in the South faced the harshest conditions, working long hours in tobacco, rice, and indigo fields under the supervision of overseers. Urban slaves might work as artisans, domestics, or laborers, sometimes with opportunities to earn money and purchase their freedom. Enslaved people maintained their own communities and cultural traditions despite the oppressive nature of their bondage. They developed distinctive forms of music, religion, and social organization that blended African traditions with American experiences. Family relationships were highly valued but constantly threatened by the possibility of sale and separation. Indentured servitude was another form of bound labor that affected hundreds of thousands of colonists. These individuals, primarily from Europe, agreed to work for a specified period, usually 4 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to America. Conditions for indentured servants varied widely, but many faced harsh treatment and difficult working conditions. The distinction between slavery and indentured servitude was crucial. Indentured servants retained basic legal rights, could expect eventual freedom, and often received land or other benefits upon completion of their service. However, the daily experiences of indentured servants and slaves could be quite similar, particularly during the terms of bondage. Free African Americans occupied a precarious position in colonial society. While some achieved economic success and community respect, they faced significant legal restrictions and social discrimination. Their numbers were small but growing, particularly in the northern colonies where gradual emancipation laws were enacted during and after the Revolutionary War. Women's status and roles. Colonial women lived within a legal and social system that severely limited their rights and opportunities. Under English common law, married women were considered femme covert, meaning they had no independent legal existence. They could not own property, make contracts, or represent themselves in court without their husband's permission. Despite these legal restrictions, women played crucial roles in colonial society and often exercised considerable informal influence. In their domestic sphere, women managed complex households, supervised servants and slaves, and made important economic decisions about production and consumption. Some women found opportunities to participate in the colonial economy despite legal restrictions. Widows could inherit and manage property, and some became successful businesswomen. Women worked as innkeepers, shopkeepers, artisans, and healers, though they were often excluded from the most profitable occupations. Educational opportunities for women were limited but varied by social class and region. Wealthy women might receive instruction in reading, writing, music, and foreign languages, while poorer women were often illiterate. However, many women gained practical education through household management and community participation. Women's religious participation provided another avenue for influence and authority. In many denominations, women comprised the majority of church members and played important roles in religious education and charitable activities. Some women, particularly in Quaker communities, were allowed to speak publicly and exercise religious leadership. The concept of Republican motherhood emerged during the later colonial period, arguing that women served the new nation by raising virtuous citizens and maintaining moral households. This ideology provided a rationale for women's education and elevated their domestic roles, though it did not challenge fundamental legal inequalities. Education and literacy. Educational opportunities in colonial America varied dramatically based on geography, social class, religion, and gender. New England colonies generally provided the most extensive educational systems, driven by Puritan beliefs about the importance of literacy for reading the Bible and participating in religious life. Elementary education was often provided through dame schools, where women taught basic reading and writing skills to neighborhood children in their homes. More formal schools were established in larger towns, usually supported by religious organizations or community funds. These schools primarily served boys, though some admitted girls for basic instruction. Secondary education was available mainly to boys from wealthy families, who might attend Latin grammar schools to prepare for college or professional careers. The curriculum emphasized classical languages, rhetoric, and religious instruction. A few girls from elite families received advanced education through private tutors or specialized academies. Higher education was limited to a small number of colleges, all of which served exclusively male students until the post-revolutionary period. Harvard, 1636, William and Mary, 1693, Yale, 1701, and 6 other colonial colleges provided education primarily for future ministers and other professionals. Literacy rates varied significantly across the colonies. New England had the highest literacy rates, with perhaps 70% of men and 45% of women able to read by the end of the colonial period. The southern colonies had lower literacy rates, particularly among women and rural populations. However, these statistics may underestimate actual literacy, as many people could read without being able to write. Practical education often occurred through apprenticeship systems, where young people learned trades by working with established craftsmen. These arrangements provided technical training along with basic education in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Apprenticeship was the primary educational route for most young people who did not come from wealthy families. Legal system and justice. Colonial legal systems were based on English common law but adapted to American conditions and needs. Each colony developed its own legal code, though there were many similarities across regions. Local courts handled most legal matters, while more serious cases went to higher colonial courts. Justice was administered by local magistrates and judges, often without formal legal training. Many legal officials were prominent community members chosen for their social standing and perceived wisdom rather than their legal expertise. This system could be both more personal and more arbitrary than modern legal systems. Legal procedures were generally simpler and less formal than in England, partly due to the shortage of trained lawyers and the practical needs of frontier communities. Many colonists represented themselves in legal proceedings, and oral testimony often carried more weight than written documentation. Punishments for criminal behavior included fines, public shaming, corporal punishment, and in extreme cases, execution. The death penalty was prescribed for various crimes including murder, treason, piracy, and some religious offenses. However, actual executions were relatively rare, and many death sentences were commuted to lesser punishments. The legal status of different groups varied significantly. White male property owners had full legal rights and could participate in the political process. Women, servants, slaves, and free blacks faced various legal restrictions. Indigenous peoples were generally excluded from colonial legal systems except when conflicts arose with colonial settlements. Civil disputes often involved property rights, debt collection, and contract enforcement. The colonial economy's reliance on credit and barter arrangements created numerous opportunities for legal conflicts. Many disputes were settled through arbitration or community mediation rather than formal court proceedings. Agriculture formed the backbone of the colonial economy, with over 90% of colonists engaged in farming activities either as primary occupations or supplementary sources of income. However, agricultural practices varied significantly across regions, reflecting differences in climate, soil, and cultural traditions brought from Europe and learned from indigenous peoples. New England agriculture was characterized by small-scale, diversified farming due to the region's rocky soil and harsh climate. Most farmers practiced subsistence agriculture, growing crops primarily for their own consumption with small surpluses for local markets. Typical crops included corn, wheat, rye, oats, vegetables, and hay for livestock. Many farmers also engaged in secondary activities like logging, fishing, or crafts during winter months. The middle colonies became known as the breadbasket of colonial America due to their fertile soil and favorable climate for grain production. Large wheat farms in Pennsylvania and New York produced significant surpluses for export to other colonies and Europe. These regions also developed substantial livestock operations, producing beef, pork, and dairy products for both local consumption and export. Southern agriculture was dominated by plantation crops that could be profitably exported to European markets. Tobacco became the most important cash crop in Virginia and Maryland, generating enormous wealth for successful planters. South Carolina developed rice cultivation in coastal areas and later added indigo as another profitable export crop. These plantation crops required intensive labor, leading to the expansion of slavery in the southern colonies. Agricultural techniques in colonial America combined European methods with indigenous knowledge and innovations developed through experience. The Three Sisters planting system, corn, beans, and squash grown together, was adopted from Native Americans and proved highly effective. Colonists also learned to use new crops like corn and potatoes that were unknown in Europe. Farm tools were relatively simple and changed little during the colonial period. Plows, harrows, sickles, scythes, and hand tools like hoes and spades were the primary implements. Most tools were made by local blacksmiths or imported from Europe. The lack of sophisticated machinery meant that farming required intensive human and animal labor. Livestock played crucial roles in colonial agriculture, providing not only meat and dairy products but also labor power and raw materials for other activities. Cattle were used for plowing and transportation as well as for milk and meat. Pigs were particularly important because they could forage for themselves and were efficient converters of waste products into protein. Sheep provided wool for textile production, while chickens supplied eggs and meat. Crafts and manufacturing. Colonial manufacturing developed gradually from simple household production to more sophisticated artisan shops and early industrial establishments. Most manufacturing remained small-scale and local throughout the colonial period, but important foundations were laid for later industrial development. Textile production was the most important manufacturing activity in colonial America. Most households produced their own cloth from locally grown or imported raw materials. Women typically handled spinning and weaving, creating linen from flax and woolen cloth from sheep's wool. As settlements matured, specialized weavers and cloth finishers established shops to serve local communities. Metalworking was another crucial craft that developed early in colonial settlements. Blacksmiths were essential community members who produced and repaired tools, horseshoes, nails, and hardware. More specialized metalworkers included gunsmiths, silversmiths, and pewterers who created both practical items and decorative objects for wealthy clients. Woodworking crafts flourished in colonial America due to abundant forest resources. Carpenters constructed buildings, shipwrights built vessels for fishing and commerce, and furniture makers created everything from simple stools to elaborate cabinets. Different regions developed distinctive styles reflecting both European traditions and American innovations. Food processing and preservation became important commercial activities as settlements grew and trade networks developed. Millers ground grain into flour, brewers produced beer and ale, and bakers provided bread for urban populations. Meat packing, cheese making, and other food preservation activities also developed as specialized trades. Pottery and ceramics production supplied essential household items like dishes, storage containers, and cooking vessels. Colonial potters initially produced simple, utilitarian wares but gradually developed more sophisticated techniques and decorative styles. By the late colonial period, some American pottery rivaled imported European ceramics in quality and artistry. Printing and publishing emerged as important industries in the larger colonial cities. Printers produced newspapers, books, pamphlets, and government documents that played crucial roles in colonial communication and culture. The printing trade required significant capital investment and specialized skills, making it an elite occupation. Shipbuilding became one of colonial America's most successful industries, particularly in New England where abundant forests provided materials and numerous harbors offered launching sites. Colonial shipyards produced vessels for both domestic and international trade, earning profits from construction as well as creating the infrastructure for maritime commerce. Trade and commerce. Colonial commerce developed from simple local exchange to sophisticated international trade networks that connected America with Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. This commercial development was crucial to colonial prosperity and helped create the economic foundations for eventual independence. Local trade began with simple barter arrangements between neighbors and gradually evolved into more complex market relationships. Country stores became important institutions that brought manufactured goods to rural areas while collecting agricultural surpluses for shipment to urban markets. These stores often operated on credit systems that allowed farmers to obtain needed goods in advance of harvest seasons. Regional trade networks connected different colonies and allowed for specialization based on comparative advantages. New England merchants traded manufactured goods and rum for southern tobacco and rice. The middle colonies exported grain and livestock products throughout colonial America. These trading relationships created economic interdependence among the colonies. International trade was the most profitable sector of colonial commerce, though it was also the most risky. Colonial merchants exported raw materials like tobacco, rice, indigo, lumber, and fish to Europe while importing manufactured goods, luxury items, and other products that could not be produced locally. This trade generated the wealth that supported colonial elites and financed further economic development. The triangular trade system connected colonial America with Europe and Africa in complex commercial relationships. Colonial merchants might export raw materials to Europe, use the profits to purchase manufactured goods, and then sell these products in America or use them to acquire enslaved people in Africa who were then transported to American plantations. These trading patterns were highly profitable but also morally compromising. Credit systems were essential to colonial commerce due to the chronic shortage of currency and the seasonal nature of many economic activities. Merchants extended credit to customers, accepted payment in goods rather than cash, and used complex bookkeeping systems to track multiple transactions. These credit relationships created both opportunities and risks for all parties involved. Transportation infrastructure gradually improved to support commercial development. Better roads connected inland areas to port cities, while improvements in shipping technology reduced costs and risks of long-distance trade. The development of postal systems also facilitated commercial communication and record-keeping. Currency and finance. Colonial America faced persistent challenges with currency and finance throughout the period. The British government prohibited colonies from minting their own coins and restricted the export of British currency, creating chronic shortages of hard money that complicated commercial transactions. Various solutions emerged to address currency shortages. Barter remained common throughout the colonial period, with standardized rates of exchange developing for common commodities like tobacco, grain, and beaver pelts. These commodity currencies provided medium of exchange but were often inconvenient and subject to quality variations. Paper money was introduced by several colonial governments as a solution to currency shortages. Massachusetts issued the first colonial paper money in 1690 to pay soldiers fighting in King William's War. Other colonies followed with their own paper currency issues, though the value of these currencies fluctuated based on public confidence and government policies. Private credit instruments also served as currency substitutes. Merchants used bills of exchange to facilitate long-distance trade, while promissory notes allowed individuals to make purchases on credit. These instruments required trust and reputation but provided flexibility in commercial transactions. Banking services were limited during the colonial period, though some merchant houses performed banking functions like accepting deposits, making loans, and arranging currency exchanges. Insurance services also developed to protect against the risks of maritime commerce and property loss. Interest rates were often regulated by colonial governments, though actual market rates varied based on supply and demand for credit. The shortage of capital meant that interest rates were generally higher than in Europe, creating both opportunities and challenges for borrowers and lenders. Labor systems and employment. Colonial labor systems included free wage labor, indentured servitude, and slavery, creating a complex hierarchy of workers with different rights, obligations, and opportunities. These labor systems evolved over time and varied significantly across regions and industries. Free wage labor was most common in New England and the Middle Colonies, where skilled artisans, laborers, and domestic workers could earn money for their services. However, wage labor was often seasonal or temporary, and many workers combined wage work with farming or other activities to ensure adequate income. Indentured servitude provided a solution for individuals who could not afford passage to America but were willing to work for several years to pay their transportation costs. These servants worked in various capacities: agricultural laborers, domestic servants, artisans' helpers, and industrial workers. Upon completion of their service terms, many received freedom dues including land, tools, or money to begin independent lives. Slavery became increasingly important to colonial labor systems, particularly in the southern colonies where plantation agriculture created high demand for workers. Enslaved people worked in various occupations beyond plantation agriculture, including household service, artisan crafts, maritime activities, and early manufacturing. Their skills and knowledge often proved essential to colonial economic development. Apprenticeship systems provided training for young people entering skilled trades. Master craftsmen accepted apprentices who lived in their households and learned trade secrets in exchange for labor. These relationships typically lasted 7 years and concluded with the apprentice becoming a journeyman qualified to work independently or eventually establish his own shop. Women's labor was essential to colonial economy but often unrecognized in formal economic systems. Women's work included household production, textile manufacturing, food processing, child care, and assistance with family businesses. Some women operated their own enterprises as innkeepers, shopkeepers, or artisans, though they faced legal restrictions and social prejudices. Child labor was common and accepted in colonial society. Children began contributing to household and family business activities at young ages, learning essential skills through participation in adult work. However, child labor was generally less intensive and more educational than in later industrial periods. Religious diversity and regional patterns. Colonial America was characterized by remarkable religious diversity, though this diversity was unevenly distributed across regions and evolved significantly over the 170-year colonial period. The religious landscape shaped every aspect of colonial life, from daily routines and community organization to politics and social hierarchies. New England was dominated by Puritan Congregationalism, which emphasized individual relationship with God, congregational self-governance, and the integration of religious and civil authority. Puritan communities were organized around the meeting house, which served both religious and governmental functions. The Puritan work ethic influenced economic development, while Puritan educational values led to high literacy rates and the establishment of schools and colleges. The Middle Colonies developed the most diverse religious environment, earning the nickname, the best poor man's country, partly due to religious tolerance that attracted various immigrant groups. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn as a Quaker colony, welcomed people of different faiths including German Lutherans, Reformed Christians, Moravians, Mennonites, and others. New York's Dutch Reformed heritage was supplemented by English Anglicans, while New Jersey and Delaware also hosted multiple denominations. The southern colonies were officially Anglican, with the Church of England serving as the established church supported by public taxes. However, actual religious practice was often less rigorous than in New England, and the plantation system created challenges for regular church attendance. Anglican parishes covered large geographical areas, and many planters built private chapels on their estates. Despite official Anglican establishment, religious diversity increased in the southern colonies over time. Presbyterian Scots-Irish immigrants settled in backcountry areas, German groups established Lutheran and Reformed communities, and Baptist and Methodist movements gained followers during the mid-18th century revivals. These dissenting groups often faced legal restrictions but gradually gained acceptance and influence. Puritan society and religious practice. Puritan religious culture profoundly shaped New England society and left lasting impacts on American culture. Puritans viewed their colonial venture as a city upon a hill, a model Christian community that would demonstrate God's will to the world. This sense of divine mission influenced their approach to governance, education, and social organization. Puritan worship centered on lengthy sermons that expounded biblical texts and their applications to daily life. Services could last several hours and included psalm singing, prayer, and communion celebrations. The meeting house was deliberately plain, reflecting Puritan rejection of Anglican ceremonial traditions they considered corrupt. Church membership required evidence of personal conversion and understanding of Christian doctrine. Not all community residents were church members, but membership was essential for full political participation. This system created a religious elite that dominated local governance while excluding those who could not demonstrate proper spiritual qualifications. Puritan family life was organized around religious principles. Family worship included daily prayers and Bible reading, with fathers serving as spiritual leaders. Children were expected to memorize catechisms and demonstrate understanding of religious principles. The Puritan emphasis on literacy stemmed from their belief that individuals needed to read the Bible for themselves. Sunday observance was strictly enforced in Puritan communities. The Sabbath began Saturday evening and continued through Sunday night, during which time all work and recreational activities were forbidden. Families attended morning and afternoon religious services, with the day devoted entirely to spiritual activities. Puritan communities also practiced collective discipline for moral offenses. Church congregations could censure or excommunicate members for various sins, while civil authorities punished moral crimes like adultery, blasphemy, and Sabbath breaking. This integration of religious and civil authority created communities with high behavioral expectations and social conformity. The Great Awakening and Religious Revival. The Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s represented a major transformation in colonial religious life, emphasizing personal religious experience over institutional authority and formal doctrine. This revival movement affected all colonies but had particularly significant impacts on social and political relationships. The movement began with the preaching of ministers like Jonathan Edwards in Massachusetts and George Whitefield, an English evangelist who conducted revival tours throughout the colonies. These preachers emphasized human sinfulness, the necessity of personal conversion, and the availability of salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. Revival meetings featured emotional preaching that often produced dramatic physical and psychological responses from audiences. People would cry out, fall down, or experience other manifestations that were interpreted as signs of spiritual awakening. These emotional displays challenged traditional emphasis on rational, controlled religious expression. The Great Awakening created divisions within existing denominations between Old Lights, who opposed revivalist methods, and New Lights, who embraced them. These divisions led to the establishment of new congregations and denominations, increasing religious diversity and competition among churches. The revival movement had significant social consequences beyond religion. It emphasized individual spiritual experience over social hierarchy, potentially undermining traditional authority structures. Common people claimed direct spiritual insights that might challenge educated clergy or established political leaders. The Great Awakening also promoted intercolonial communication and identity. Revival preachers traveled between colonies, creating networks of communication and shared experience that transcended colonial boundaries. This development contributed to the emergence of American identity distinct from purely local or regional loyalties. Educational institutions founded during and after the Great Awakening included Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth, established to train ministers sympathetic to revival principles. These colleges expanded educational opportunities while promoting particular theological perspectives. Religious minorities and tolerance. Religious minorities in colonial America faced varying degrees of acceptance and persecution depending on their location and the dominant religious culture. The development of religious tolerance was gradual and uneven, influenced by practical considerations as well as philosophical principles. Quakers, Society of Friends, faced severe persecution in the early colonial period, particularly in Massachusetts where several were executed for their beliefs. Quaker practices including silent worship, rejection of formal clergy, and refusal to take oaths or participate in military service challenged prevailing religious and social norms. However, Pennsylvania's Quaker government demonstrated that religious tolerance could coexist with social order. Catholics remained a small minority throughout the colonial period and faced legal restrictions in most colonies. Maryland, founded as a Catholic refuge, initially practiced religious tolerance but later came under Protestant control. Catholic worship was often conducted privately, and Catholics were excluded from political participation in most areas. Jewish communities were established in several colonial cities including New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Newport. These small communities built synagogues and maintained religious and cultural traditions while participating in colonial commerce. Though they faced some legal restrictions, Jewish colonists generally experienced less persecution than in Europe. German religious groups brought distinctive traditions to colonial America, particularly in Pennsylvania. Mennonites, Amish, Moravians, and other sectarian groups established communities that preserved their religious practices while adapting to American conditions. These groups often practiced pacifism and maintained separate cultural identities. Native American religions faced systematic suppression as European colonization expanded. Christian missionaries attempted to convert indigenous peoples, often with support from colonial governments. However, many Native Americans maintained their traditional spiritual practices while selectively adopting Christian elements, creating syncretic religious forms. The concept of religious tolerance developed gradually during the colonial period, influenced by Enlightenment philosophy, practical necessities, and colonial experience. Rhode Island, founded by Roger Williams, pioneered religious liberty as a fundamental principle. Pennsylvania's Quaker leadership also promoted tolerance as both a religious duty and practical necessity for attracting diverse immigrant populations. Role of clergy and religious institutions. Colonial clergy occupied positions of significant authority and influence, serving not only as spiritual leaders but also as educators, community advisors, and political figures. The social status and functions of clergy varied among denominations and regions, but ministers generally ranked among the most educated and respected members of colonial society. Puritan ministers in New England underwent extensive theological education and were expected to deliver learned sermons that interpreted biblical texts and applied them to contemporary issues. Many Harvard and Yale graduates entered the ministry, creating a highly educated clerical class that dominated intellectual life in Puritan communities. Anglican clergy in the southern colonies were often less influential than their Puritan counterparts, partly due to the geographical challenges of serving large, dispersed parishes. Many Anglican ministers were educated in England and sometimes struggled to adapt to American conditions. The absence of Anglican bishops in America also created administrative challenges for church governance. Presbyterian, Lutheran, and Reformed ministers in the Middle Colonies often served immigrant communities that maintained strong connections to European religious traditions. These clergy helped preserve cultural identity while facilitating adaptation to American society. Many conducted services in languages other than English and maintained correspondence with European religious leaders. Colonial churches served multiple functions beyond worship services. They provided education through church schools and Sunday instruction, offered social welfare assistance to needy community members, and served as centers for community meetings and social gatherings. Church buildings were often the largest and most substantial structures in colonial communities. Religious institutions also played important roles in colonial politics and social control. Ministers often addressed political issues in their sermons, church membership could influence political participation, and religious courts handled various moral and family disputes. The integration of religious and civil authority was most complete in New England but existed to some degree throughout colonial America. The training and support of clergy varied significantly among denominations. Established churches like Anglicanism and Congregationalism had more systematic educational and financial support systems, while newer denominations often relied on less formal training methods and community support. Death, dying, and spiritual beliefs. Colonial attitudes toward death and dying were profoundly influenced by religious beliefs and the harsh realities of life in early America. High mortality rates, particularly among infants and children, made death a constant presence in colonial communities and shaped spiritual practices and community relationships. Puritan theology emphasized the sovereignty of God in determining life and death, leading to acceptance of mortality while maintaining strict behavioral standards to demonstrate salvation. Puritan deathbed scenes often featured public testimonies of faith and final spiritual counsel to family and community members. Colonial funerals were important community events that reinforced religious beliefs and social relationships. Funeral sermons provided opportunities for ministers to address theological themes while commemorating the deceased. Burial practices varied among denominations but generally emphasized simplicity and spiritual rather than material considerations. Cemetery practices reflected religious beliefs and social hierarchies. Puritan graveyards featured plain markers with biblical inscriptions, while Anglican churchyards might include more elaborate monuments for wealthy families. The location and design of cemeteries expressed community values about death and remembrance. Colonial wills and estate planning documents often included religious language and charitable bequests that reflected spiritual priorities. Many colonists left money for church construction, ministerial support, or assistance to the poor, viewing these gifts as expressions of their faith and preparation for afterlife. The doctrine of predestination, particularly important in Calvinist traditions, created anxiety about salvation that influenced daily behavior and community relationships. Colonists sought evidence of their spiritual condition through personal introspection and community observation of behavior and spiritual experiences. Colonial responses to epidemic diseases and natural disasters reflected religious interpretations of divine providence and human responsibility. Communities often interpreted catastrophes as divine judgments requiring repentance and reform, leading to periods of increased religious activity and moral strictness. Colonial government structure. Colonial political systems evolved from simple survival-oriented arrangements to sophisticated governmental institutions that balanced local autonomy with imperial oversight. These systems reflected both English legal traditions and American adaptations to local conditions and needs. Each colony developed its own governmental structure, though most followed similar patterns by the mid-18th century. Colonial governments typically included three branches: a governor representing royal or proprietary authority, a bicameral legislature representing colonial interests, and a court system administering justice according to English common law adapted to local circumstances. Royal colonies were governed by officials appointed by the British Crown, while proprietary colonies were managed by individuals or families who had received grants from the monarch. Charter colonies like Connecticut and Rhode Island enjoyed greater self-governance through elected officials. However, all colonies remained subject to British oversight and imperial regulations. The governors served as the chief executive officer and representative of British authority. Royal governors were appointed by the Crown, while proprietary governors were chosen by the colony's owners. Governors had extensive powers including commanding military forces, appointing officials, convening legislatures, and enforcing imperial policies. However, their effectiveness often depended on cooperation from colonial assemblies who controlled taxation and spending. Colonial assemblies emerged as powerful institutions representing settler interests. The lower house was typically elected by qualified voters, while the upper house, council, was usually appointed by the governor. These assemblies claimed rights similar to those of the British Parliament, including control over taxation, legislation, and government spending. Local government systems varied among regions but generally included county courts, town meetings, or parish vestries that handled local administration. These institutions managed road construction, poor relief, tax collection, and local law enforcement. They provided colonists with direct experience in self-governance and democratic participation. The relationship between colonial and imperial authority created ongoing tensions that would eventually contribute to the American Revolution. Colonists developed strong traditions of self-governance while remaining subject to British policies they could not directly influence. These tensions increased during the 18th century as imperial oversight became more systematic and intrusive. Voting rights and political participation. Political participation in colonial America was limited by various qualifications including property ownership, gender, race, and religion. These restrictions meant that only a minority of adult colonists could vote or hold office, though the proportion of eligible voters was higher than in England. Property qualifications for voting varied among colonies but generally required ownership of land or other assets worth a specified amount. The rationale was that property ownership demonstrated a stake in society and independence from other men's influence. These requirements excluded many workers, servants, and younger men who had not yet acquired property. Women were universally excluded from formal political participation, reflecting legal traditions that viewed them as represented by their husbands or fathers. However, some women influenced politics informally through family relationships, religious activities, or community involvement. Widows occasionally inherited property that would have qualified them for voting if they had been men. Free African Americans faced additional restrictions beyond property qualifications. Some colonies explicitly excluded them from voting, while others applied property requirements that few free blacks could meet. Enslaved people had no political rights and were counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of legislative representation. Religious qualifications also limited political participation in some colonies. Massachusetts and other New England colonies initially restricted voting and office holding to church members. Other colonies required oath-taking or specific religious affiliations that excluded Catholics, Jews, and members of certain Protestant denominations. Despite these restrictions, colonial political participation was broader than in most European societies. A significant minority of white men could vote in local and colonial elections, creating competitive political environments in many communities. This experience with democratic participation would prove important during the Revolutionary Crisis. Town meetings in New England provided the most democratic form of political participation, allowing all qualified male residents to debate and vote on local issues. These meetings handled taxation, resource allocation, and community regulations, giving participants direct experience with democratic decision-making. Colonial elections were often contentious affairs involving extensive campaigning, treating of voters with food and drink, and sometimes violence or fraud. The development of political factions and interest groups created competitive environments that encouraged broader political engagement among qualified participants. Law enforcement and criminal justice. Colonial law enforcement relied primarily on local officials and community cooperation rather than professional police forces. Sheriffs, constables, and justices of the peace handled most law enforcement activities, though their effectiveness varied greatly depending on community support and individual competence. Sheriffs were appointed by colonial governors and served as the primary law enforcement officials in county areas. They were responsible for serving legal documents, collecting taxes, maintaining jails, and executing court orders. Sheriffs often relied on temporary deputies or volunteer posses to assist with major law enforcement activities. Constables served similar functions in towns and local communities. These positions were often filled by election or rotation among qualified community members rather than by professional appointment. Constables handled minor law violations, served court papers, and maintained local order during community events. Justices of the peace were local magistrates who handled minor legal matters, performed marriages, and supervised various administrative functions. Most justices lacked formal legal training but were chosen for their social standing and perceived wisdom. They provided accessible justice for routine legal matters. Colonial criminal law was based on English common law but adapted to American conditions and values. The death penalty was prescribed for serious crimes including murder, treason, piracy, burglary, and some religious offenses. However, actual executions were relatively uncommon, and many capital sentences were commuted to lesser punishments. Physical punishments were common for various crimes. Whipping, branding, time in stocks or pillory, and public humiliation were frequently used to punish offenders and deter others. These public punishments reinforced community values and provided entertainment as well as moral instruction. Colonial jails were primarily holding facilities for people awaiting trial rather than long-term punishment institutions. Conditions were often harsh, with prisoners responsible for their own food and bedding. Debtors were frequently imprisoned alongside criminals, reflecting the period's approach to financial obligations. Community involvement in law enforcement was essential due to the limited number of official law enforcement personnel. Citizens were expected to report crimes, assist in apprehending suspects, and serve on juries when called. This system relied heavily on social cohesion and shared values within communities. Taxation and public finance. Colonial taxation systems developed to meet the costs of government operations while reflecting political principles about representation and consent. These systems created ongoing tensions between colonial assemblies and imperial authorities that would eventually contribute to revolutionary sentiment. Property taxes were the most important source of colonial revenue, typically assessed on land, buildings, livestock, and personal property. Tax assessment and collection were handled by local officials who often faced community pressure to keep rates low and assessment fair. Property tax systems encouraged economic development by placing the burden on wealth rather than economic activity. Poll taxes, head taxes, were levied on adult males in some colonies, providing revenue while being relatively easy to assess and collect. However, these taxes were regressive and sometimes unpopular among poorer colonists. Some colonies used poll taxes specifically to fund particular activities like road construction or military expenses. Import and export duties provided revenue for colonial governments while regulating trade patterns. These taxes were easier to collect at ports than property taxes in rural areas, but they could discourage commerce if set too high. Conflicts over trade duties contributed to tensions between colonial merchants and imperial authorities. Colonial assemblies controlled most taxation and spending decisions, giving them significant power over colonial governors and policies. This power of the purse was zealously guarded by colonial representatives who viewed it as essential to protecting colonial interests against arbitrary imperial policies. Public expenditures focused on essential governmental functions including military defense, road construction, court systems, and administrative salaries. Colonial governments generally provided fewer services than modern governments, relying more heavily on private and community initiatives for education, welfare, and economic development. Military expenses represented a major portion of colonial budgets, particularly during periods of warfare with Native Americans or European powers. Colonial militias required equipment, supplies, and sometimes pay, while fortifications and other defensive measures required significant capital investments. The shortage of currency complicated colonial tax collection and public finance. Taxes were often paid in commodities like tobacco or grain rather than cash, requiring government officials to manage storage and disposal of tax goods. Some colonies issued paper currency to facilitate tax payment and government operations. Imperial relations and colonial autonomy. The relationship between colonial and imperial authority evolved significantly during the 170-year colonial period, generally moving from loose oversight to more systematic control. This evolution created increasing tensions as colonists developed strong traditions of self-governance while remaining subject to policies made in London. Early colonial charters granted considerable autonomy to colonial governments, reflecting the British government's limited capacity for overseas administration and the practical difficulties of governing distant territories. Many colonies were initially governed by private companies or proprietors who had more interest in profit than in imperial policy coordination. The Navigation Acts, beginning in the 1650s, represented the first systematic attempt to regulate colonial trade and integrate the colonies into a coherent imperial economic system. These laws required colonial trade to be conducted in British ships and prohibited colonies from trading certain products directly with foreign countries. Imperial oversight increased significantly after 1763 as Britain faced enormous debts from the 7 Years' War and sought to make the colonies contribute more to their own defense and administration. New policies included the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, and Townshend Acts that imposed taxes and regulations without colonial consent. Colonial responses to increased imperial control included both legal protests and illegal resistance. Colonial assemblies passed resolutions denying parliamentary authority to tax the colonies without representation. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods, while some colonists engaged in smuggling and violence against imperial officials. The concept of colonial rights evolved during conflicts with imperial authority. Colonists initially claimed the rights of Englishmen under the British Constitution, but gradually developed theories of natural rights and consent that went beyond traditional English political theory. These intellectual developments provided justifications for eventual independence. Intercolonial cooperation increased in response to imperial policies, creating mechanisms for coordinated resistance and shared identity. The Stamp Act Congress, 1765, Committees of Correspondence, and Continental Congresses provided forums for colonial leaders to coordinate policies and develop common positions. The breakdown of imperial relations culminated in the Declaration of Independence, 1776, which formally ended the colonial period and began the era of American independence. However, the colonial experience with self-governance, resistance to arbitrary authority, and intercolonial cooperation provided essential foundations for the new nation. Chapter 7. Cultural Life and Intellectual Development. Literature and Publishing. Colonial American literature developed from practical necessity to sophisticated artistic expression, reflecting both European influences and distinctive American experiences. The evolution of colonial writing reveals changing intellectual interests, social values, and cultural aspirations throughout the period. Early colonial writing was dominated by practical and religious purposes. Promotional literature attracted potential settlers by describing American opportunities and resources, though these accounts were often exaggerated or misleading. Captain John Smith's writings about Virginia combined adventure narratives with practical advice, creating a template for colonial promotional literature. Religious writing constituted the largest category of colonial literature, reflecting the central role of religion in colonial society. Puritan ministers produced sermons, theological treatises, and devotional works that influenced both religious practice and literary style. Jonathan Edwards combined rigorous Calvinist theology with sophisticated literary techniques in works like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Historical writing emerged as colonists sought to record and interpret their experiences. William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation and John Winthrop's journal provided detailed accounts of early New England settlement, while later historians like Cotton Mather attempted to place colonial events within broader providential frameworks. Poetry developed from simple religious verses to sophisticated artistic expression. Anne Bradstreet, America's first published poet, wrote personal and religious poetry that combined Puritan theology with classical literary forms. Edward Taylor's metaphysical poetry remained unpublished during his lifetime but demonstrated the high literary culture achieved in colonial New England. Colonial newspapers emerged in the early 18th century and played crucial roles in information dissemination and political debate. The first successful newspaper was the Boston News Letter, 1704, followed by papers in other major cities. These publications provided news, commercial information, and forums for political discussion that contributed to colonial identity formation. Book publishing developed slowly in colonial America due to limited markets and competition from imported British books. Most colonial publications were practical works like almanacs, religious texts, and government documents. However, by the mid-18th century, American printers were producing literature, history, and political works that reflected distinctively American perspectives. Libraries and reading societies promoted literary culture in colonial cities. The Library Company of Philadelphia, founded by Benjamin Franklin, provided books and reading rooms for subscribers. These institutions created communities of readers and writers that fostered intellectual exchange and cultural development. Colonial literature began developing distinctive American themes and styles by the mid-18th century. Writers increasingly focused on American subjects, landscapes, and social conditions rather than simply imitating European models. This literary nationalism would continue to develop during the Revolutionary and early national periods. Arts and crafts. Colonial American arts and crafts reflected both European traditions and adaptations to American materials and conditions. The development of distinctive American artistic styles occurred gradually as colonial artisans gained confidence and prosperity increased demand for decorative as well as functional objects. Architecture evolved from simple survival structures to sophisticated buildings that demonstrated both practicality and aesthetic ambition. Early colonial architecture combined European building traditions with American materials and climate considerations. Regional differences emerged as colonists adapted to local conditions while maintaining cultural preferences. New England architecture featured timber frame construction with clapboard siding and steep roofs designed to shed snow and rain. The distinctive saltbox house shape evolved through practical additions to original structures. By the 18th century, wealthy New Englanders built impressive Georgian-style houses with symmetrical facades and sophisticated interior decoration. Southern architecture adapted to warmer climates with features like raised foundations, wide porches, and large windows for ventilation. The grandest plantation houses featured imposing facades and elaborate interior spaces designed for entertaining and displaying wealth. These buildings combined English architectural traditions with practical adaptations to American conditions. Furniture making developed from simple necessity to sophisticated craftsmanship as colonial prosperity increased. Early colonial furniture was primarily functional, often made by farmers or general craftsmen during winter months. As communities matured, specialized furniture makers created pieces that rivaled European work in quality and design. Distinctive American furniture styles emerged by the mid-18th century, particularly in centers like Newport, New York, and Philadelphia. Colonial furniture makers developed unique interpretations of European styles using American woods like pine, maple, and walnut. The Chippendale style adapted to American tastes produced some of the finest furniture in colonial America. Metalworking crafts produced both functional and decorative objects that demonstrated high levels of skill and artistry. Paul Revere and other silversmiths created elaborate silver services for wealthy families, while pewter workers produced more affordable decorative objects for middle-class households. Pottery and ceramics evolved from crude utilitarian wares to sophisticated decorative pieces. Colonial potters initially focused on practical items like storage containers and cooking vessels, but gradually developed more sophisticated techniques and decorative styles. Some colonial pottery achieved artistic levels that competed with imported European ceramics. Textile arts included both functional and decorative work that demonstrated exceptional skill and creativity. Women produced elaborate quilts, coverlets, and embroidered items that combined practical function with artistic expression. These textile arts preserved European traditions while adapting to American materials and conditions. Portrait painting emerged as an important art form as colonial wealth increased. Limners, portrait painters, traveled between communities creating portraits for wealthy families who wanted to display their prosperity and status. John Singleton Copley and other colonial artists achieved international recognition for their sophisticated portraiture. Music and performance. Colonial American music reflected the diverse cultural backgrounds of settlers while adapting to American conditions and developing distinctive characteristics. Music served both practical and artistic purposes, from religious worship and work activities to entertainment and social bonding. Religious music dominated colonial musical culture, particularly in New England where psalm singing was central to Puritan worship. The Bay Psalm Book, 1640, the first book published in colonial America, provided metrical translations of psalms for congregational singing. Musical notation was often simplified or omitted entirely, leading to diverse singing traditions within communities. Secular music included both imported European songs and music developed in America. Work songs helped coordinate labor activities like hauling, chopping, and rowing, while social songs provided entertainment at gatherings and celebrations. Folk ballads preserved stories and cultural traditions that might otherwise have been forgotten. Musical instruments were initially scarce and expensive, often imported from Europe or made by local craftsmen with limited expertise. Wealthy colonists might own harpsichords, violins, or flutes, while common instruments included simple drums, fifes, and homemade stringed instruments. The availability of instruments influenced the types of music that could be performed. Dancing was popular throughout colonial America despite occasional religious opposition. Country dances, minuets, and reels provided social entertainment at gatherings ranging from informal parties to elaborate balls. Dance masters taught proper techniques to wealthy families, while simpler folk dances were passed down through community participation. Military music played important roles during conflicts and ceremonial occasions. Fife and drum corps provided communication during battles and entertainment during peacetime. Military bands performed for official ceremonies and public celebrations, helping create shared experiences and community identity. African American musical traditions developed within the constraints of slavery while preserving cultural elements from Africa. Work songs, spirituals, and secular music created by enslaved people combined African rhythms and call-and-response patterns with European melodies and Christian themes. These musical traditions would profoundly influence later American popular music. Theater and dramatic performance developed slowly in colonial America due to religious opposition and practical constraints. Professional theater companies occasionally toured colonial cities, while amateur theatricals provided entertainment in some communities. The first professional theater was established in Williamsburg in 1718, followed by theaters in other major cities. Musical education expanded during the colonial period as prosperity increased and cultural sophistication developed. Singing schools taught musical notation and vocal techniques, while private music teachers served wealthy families. Music publishing also developed, making printed music more widely available than in the early colonial period. Science and natural philosophy. Colonial American science developed from practical necessity and intellectual curiosity into sophisticated investigation of natural phenomena. Colonial scientists contributed to international scientific communities while addressing practical problems related to agriculture, medicine, and engineering. Natural history dominated early colonial scientific activity as settlers sought to understand and catalog American plants, animals, and minerals. John Bartram established America's first botanical garden in Philadelphia and corresponded with European scientists about American flora. His son William continued this work with detailed observations of southeastern ecosystems. Astronomy attracted colonial attention both for practical navigation purposes and intellectual satisfaction. Colonial almanacs included astronomical calculations and observations that served practical and educational functions. The transit of Venus observations in 1769 involved colonial scientists in international scientific cooperation. Medical practice gradually evolved from folk remedies and imported European traditions to more systematic investigation of American diseases and treatments. Colonial physicians like Cotton Mather supported smallpox inoculation despite popular opposition, demonstrating commitment to scientific evidence over traditional beliefs. Benjamin Franklin epitomized colonial scientific achievement through his investigations of electricity and numerous practical inventions. His electrical experiments gained international recognition and contributed to fundamental understanding of electrical phenomena. Franklin also invented practical devices like the Pennsylvania fireplace and bifocal glasses that improved daily life. Agricultural science developed through practical experimentation with crops, soil management, and animal breeding. Colonial farmers adapted European techniques to American conditions while learning from indigenous agricultural practices. Agricultural societies promoted scientific farming methods and information exchange among farmers. Engineering and technology addressed practical problems related to transportation, manufacturing, and construction. Colonial engineers designed bridges, canals, and buildings that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mechanics and materials. Water-powered mills for grain grinding and textile production required engineering skills that developed through practical experience. Scientific societies and institutions promoted intellectual exchange and investigation. The American Philosophical Society, founded in Philadelphia in 1743, provided a forum for scientific discussion and publication. Colonial colleges also contributed to scientific development through teaching and research activities. Colonial scientific achievements gained international recognition and contributed to European understanding of natural phenomena. Colonial scientists corresponded with European colleagues, contributed to scientific publications, and participated in international research projects. This scientific activity helped establish American intellectual credibility and cultural sophistication. Education and intellectual life. Colonial education systems reflected religious, social, and practical priorities while adapting to American conditions and opportunities. Educational institutions evolved from simple survival needs to sophisticated systems that would influence later American intellectual development. Elementary education varied significantly among regions and social classes. New England's Puritan emphasis on religious literacy led to laws requiring towns to establish schools, creating the most systematic elementary education system in colonial America. The Massachusetts School Law of 1647 required towns with 50 families to hire a teacher and towns with 100 families to establish grammar schools. Dame schools provided basic education in many communities, with women teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic in their homes. These schools served both boys and girls, though girls' education typically ended earlier than boys'. Dame schools filled important gaps in formal education systems while providing income for women. Apprenticeship systems provided practical education for many colonial youth who would not attend formal schools. Master craftsmen taught technical skills while also providing basic literacy and numeracy instruction. Apprenticeship contracts often specified educational requirements along with technical training obligations. Secondary education was available primarily to boys from wealthy families who could afford grammar school tuition and foregone labor. Latin grammar schools prepared students for college admission through classical language instruction and literary studies. These schools created educated elites who would dominate colonial and early American intellectual life. Higher education developed to meet the need for educated clergy, lawyers, and other professionals. Harvard College, 1636, was established to train Puritan ministers, followed by William and Mary, 1693, Yale, 1701, and 6 other colonial colleges by 1776. These institutions provided classical education based on European university models. Colonial colleges gradually expanded their curricula beyond traditional classical and religious studies to include natural philosophy, mathematics, and modern languages. This curricular development reflected Enlightenment influences and practical needs for broader educated leadership in colonial society. Libraries and reading societies supported intellectual development in colonial communities. Private libraries in wealthy homes, institutional libraries in colleges and churches, and subscription libraries like Philadelphia's Library Company provided access to books and intellectual resources that fostered learning and cultural development. Scientific and philosophical societies promoted intellectual exchange and investigation among educated colonists. The American Philosophical Society and similar organizations provided forums for presenting research, discussing ideas, and maintaining correspondence with European intellectual communities. Colonial intellectual life was increasingly influenced by Enlightenment ideas about reason, natural law, and human progress. Works by John Locke, Isaac Newton, and other European thinkers shaped colonial thinking about government, religion, and natural phenomena. These intellectual influences would prove crucial during the Revolutionary Crisis and founding of the new nation. Women's education remained limited throughout the colonial period, though some women achieved remarkable intellectual accomplishments. Mercy Otis Warren wrote political plays and historical works, while Abigail Adams maintained extensive correspondence that demonstrated sophisticated political thinking. However, most women's education focused on domestic skills rather than academic subjects. Disease and mortality patterns. Colonial Americans faced numerous health challenges that significantly affected life expectancy, family structure, and community development. Understanding these health patterns is crucial for appreciating the daily realities of colonial life and the remarkable resilience of people who built American society under difficult conditions. Epidemic diseases posed the greatest health threats to colonial communities. Smallpox was perhaps the most feared disease, capable of killing 20 to 30% of those infected and leaving survivors scarred for life. Major smallpox epidemics occurred roughly every decade, devastating communities that lacked immunity. The disease particularly affected Native American populations who had no previous exposure, sometimes destroying entire villages. Other epidemic diseases included yellow fever, which particularly affected port cities during summer months, and influenza, which could spread rapidly through communities. Measles, whooping cough, and scarlet fever were especially dangerous to children, contributing to high infant and childhood mortality rates that reach 30 to 40% in some communities. Endemic diseases created ongoing health problems that weakened individuals and communities. Malaria was widespread in southern colonies and coastal areas where mosquito breeding grounds provided ideal conditions for disease transmission. Tuberculosis affected people in all regions and social classes, causing gradual decline and death over months or years. Dysentery and other intestinal diseases caused frequent illness and death, particularly in crowded urban areas with poor sanitation. These diseases were especially dangerous for children and elderly people, contributing to high mortality rates in these vulnerable populations. Maternal and infant mortality rates were extremely high by modern standards, with perhaps 1 in 8 women dying in childbirth and 1 in 3 infants failing to survive their first year. These statistics meant that most colonial families experienced the loss of children, and many children grew up without their mothers. Life expectancy varied significantly by region, social class, and time period. In healthy areas like rural New England, people who survived childhood might live into their 60s or 70s. However, in disease-prone areas like early Virginia or urban centers, life expectancy could be much shorter. Overall, colonial life expectancy was probably 15 to 20 years shorter than in modern America. Injuries and accidents also contributed to colonial mortality, particularly among men engaged in dangerous occupations like logging, mining, or seafaring. Work-related injuries often became infected due to poor medical care, turning minor accidents into life-threatening conditions. Medical knowledge and practice. Colonial medicine combined traditional European practices with indigenous knowledge and practical experience gained through treating American diseases and conditions. Medical understanding was limited by the lack of scientific knowledge about disease causation, though dedicated practitioners developed effective treatments for some conditions. The theory of humoral medicine dominated colonial medical thinking, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman traditions. According to this theory, health depended on maintaining proper balance among 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness resulted from imbalance among these humors, requiring treatments to restore equilibrium. Bloodletting was the most common medical treatment, used for almost every condition from headaches to fevers. Physicians believed that removing excess blood would restore humoral balance and cure disease. While this treatment was usually ineffective and sometimes harmful, it persisted throughout the colonial period due to theoretical support and occasional apparent success. Purging and vomiting were other common treatments designed to expel disease-causing imbalances. Physicians administered powerful drugs to induce these effects, often making patients sicker in the short term while hoping for eventual recovery. These treatments reflected the belief that disease was something that could be expelled from the body. Herbal medicine provided many colonial treatments, drawing from European traditions, indigenous knowledge, and practical experimentation. Colonial physicians and folk healers used hundreds of plant remedies for various conditions, some of which were genuinely effective. Willow bark, containing compounds similar to aspirin, treated pain and fever, while digitalis helped some heart conditions. Surgical procedures were limited by the lack of anesthesia and antiseptic techniques. Simple operations like setting bones or removing superficial tumors might be attempted, but major surgery was extremely dangerous and usually fatal. Amputation was sometimes performed for severely injured limbs, though survival rates were low. Nutrition and diet-related health. Colonial diets varied significantly by region, social class, and season, affecting health outcomes and disease susceptibility. Understanding colonial nutrition helps explain patterns of illness and mortality while revealing how people adapted to available food resources. Seasonal variation in food availability created cycles of plenty and scarcity that affected nutritional status. Spring was often the most difficult time, when stored foods from the previous year were running low and new crops had not yet matured. This starving time contributed to increased susceptibility to disease and higher mortality rates. Vitamin deficiencies caused specific health problems that colonial physicians did not understand but learned to recognize and sometimes treat. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, affected people who lacked access to fresh fruits and vegetables during winter months. Sailors on long voyages were particularly susceptible to this disease. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, affected children in northern climates where sunlight exposure was limited during winter months. This condition caused bone deformities and increased susceptibility to fractures, though its cause was not understood during the colonial period. Protein deficiency was less common than vitamin deficiencies due to the availability of meat and fish in most colonial diets. However, poor families might experience protein shortages during difficult economic periods or crop failures. Children were particularly vulnerable to protein deficiency during critical growth periods. Food preservation techniques sometimes created health hazards while solving the problem of food storage. Salted meats could contain dangerous levels of sodium, while improperly preserved foods might harbor harmful bacteria or toxins. Lead poisoning from pewter dishes and lead-glazed pottery also posed health risks. Contaminated water supplies contributed to numerous health problems, particularly in urban areas where sanitation was inadequate. Dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases spread rapidly through communities with poor water quality. Many colonists preferred alcoholic beverages partly because they were safer than water. Alcoholism was a significant health problem in colonial America, where alcohol consumption was extremely high by modern standards. Beer, cider, and rum were consumed daily by most adults and even children. While moderate alcohol consumption may have provided some protection against waterborne diseases, excessive drinking created serious health and social problems. Food adulteration and contamination posed additional health risks in colonial markets. Unscrupulous merchants might dilute milk with water, add harmful substances to preserve foods, or sell spoiled products. The absence of food safety regulations meant that consumers had to rely on their own judgment and vendor reputation. Dental health was generally poor in colonial America due to limited understanding of dental hygiene and the absence of professional dental care. Tooth decay and gum disease were common, often leading to tooth loss and facial infections. Some colonial physicians extracted teeth, but dental care was generally primitive and painful. Environmental health hazards. Colonial Americans faced numerous environmental health hazards that contributed to disease and mortality. These hazards were often poorly understood but significantly affected community health and individual survival. Air pollution was a serious problem in colonial cities where wood and coal burning for heating and manufacturing created smoke and particulate pollution. Indoor air quality was often worse than outdoor air due to open fires and poor ventilation. These conditions contributed to respiratory problems and may have increased susceptibility to lung diseases. Water pollution affected both urban and rural communities, though urban areas generally faced more severe problems. Cities dumped waste into rivers and harbors that also served as water sources, creating cycles of contamination and disease. Rural areas might face pollution from mining activities or industrial operations. Occupational hazards varied by trade but often included exposure to toxic materials, dangerous machinery, and harsh working conditions. Miners faced risks from cave-ins, gas explosions, and lung diseases caused by dust inhalation. Shipyard workers were exposed to tar, paint fumes, and dangerous tools. Lead poisoning was a significant but unrecognized health hazard in colonial America. Lead was used in glazes for pottery and pewter, paint pigments, and plumbing materials. Chronic lead exposure caused neurological problems, reproductive difficulties, and other health issues that were not attributed to their true cause. Agricultural hazards included injuries from tools and animals, exposure to plant toxins, and ergot poisoning from contaminated grain. Farm work was physically demanding and dangerous, with limited safety equipment or medical care available for injuries. Housing conditions contributed to various health problems, particularly for poor families who lived in overcrowded, poorly ventilated dwellings. These conditions facilitated disease transmission and created environments where respiratory illnesses and other infections could spread rapidly. Climate and weather patterns affected health through their influence on disease vectors, food production, and living conditions. Harsh winters increased mortality rates, while hot, humid summers created conditions favorable to disease-carrying insects and bacterial growth. Industrial pollution began affecting some colonial communities as manufacturing developed. Tanneries, metalworking shops, and other operations released pollutants into air and water that affected community health. The absence of environmental regulations meant that these problems were often ignored until they became severe. Mental health and emotional well-being. Mental health in colonial America was poorly understood but significantly affected individuals and communities. The stresses of colonial life, combined with limited understanding of psychological disorders, created challenges that were addressed through religious, medical, and social approaches. Religious explanations for mental illness predominated in colonial thinking, with unusual behavior often attributed to divine punishment, demonic influence, or spiritual crisis. These interpretations influenced treatment approaches and community responses to individuals with mental health problems. Melancholy was the most commonly recognized mental health condition, roughly corresponding to what would now be called depression. Colonial physicians treated melancholy with bloodletting, purging, and herbal remedies, while ministers addressed the spiritual dimensions they believed were involved. Severe mental illness was often viewed as madness or distraction that required physical restraint or confinement. Families typically cared for mentally ill relatives at home, though some communities established facilities for people who were considered dangerous or unable to care for themselves. Alcohol abuse was recognized as a serious problem that affected both individual health and community welfare. Colonial communities developed various approaches to managing alcoholism, including legal restrictions, religious counseling, and social pressure. Post-traumatic stress from warfare, violence, or disasters was not understood as a medical condition but was nevertheless experienced by many colonists. Veterans of Indian wars, survivors of epidemics, and witnesses to violence might exhibit symptoms that would now be recognized as PTSD. Grief and bereavement were common experiences in colonial America due to high mortality rates and frequent family disruptions. Communities developed customs and practices to support bereaved individuals, though the psychological impact of repeated losses was not fully appreciated. Women's mental health was often viewed through the lens of hysteria or other conditions that attributed psychological problems to female physiology. These interpretations influenced treatment approaches and may have prevented appropriate care for women with genuine mental health needs. Suicide was rare but not unknown in colonial America, typically attributed to despair, mental illness, or demonic influence. Communities struggled with appropriate responses to suicide, balancing religious condemnation with human compassion for suffering individuals and their families. Social support systems provided important resources for mental health, though they were informal and often inadequate. Extended families, religious communities, and neighborhood networks offered assistance and comfort, but professional mental health care was essentially non-existent. The development of more humane approaches to mental illness began during the late colonial period as Enlightenment ideas influenced American thinking. Reformers like Benjamin Rush began advocating for more scientific approaches to mental health care, laying foundations for later developments in psychological treatment. Community organization and social networks. Colonial communities were organized around complex networks of relationships that provided both social support and mechanisms for maintaining order. These networks reflected European traditions adapted to American conditions and created the social fabric that held colonial society together. Extended family relationships formed the foundation of colonial social organization. Multiple generations often lived in close proximity, creating networks of mutual support and shared responsibility. Grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes aunts, uncles, and cousins shared resources and assisted each other through various challenges. Kinship networks extended beyond immediate family to include in-laws, godparents, and fictive kin relationships that created additional social bonds. Marriage created alliances between families that often involved economic cooperation and mutual assistance. These extended kinship networks were particularly important in frontier areas where formal institutions were limited. Neighborhood relationships provided daily social interaction and practical cooperation. Neighbors assisted each other with agricultural work, house construction, child care, and emergency situations. The concept of neighboring involved both informal friendships and formal obligations that helped communities function effectively. Religious congregations created important social networks that transcended family relationships while reinforcing shared values and beliefs. Church membership involved participation in worship services, community meetings, and mutual support activities. These religious communities often provided the primary social identity for colonial families. Occupational groups developed their own social networks and cultural practices. Artisans in similar trades often lived and worked in proximity, sharing techniques, apprentices, and market information. Merchants developed commercial networks that facilitated trade while creating social relationships based on mutual trust and shared interests. Gender-specific social networks provided support and identity for both men and women. Women's networks often centered around domestic activities like quilting bees, food preparation, and child care, while men's networks might focus on work activities, military service, or political participation. Social clubs and voluntary associations emerged in colonial cities, providing forums for intellectual discussion, charitable activities, and social interaction. Organizations like fire companies, libraries, and benevolent societies created opportunities for community involvement and leadership development. The concept of social capital was crucial to colonial community life, though the term was not used at the time. Individuals and families built reputations for reliability, honesty, and community involvement that provided access to resources and opportunities. This social capital could be more valuable than financial wealth in determining life outcomes. Community festivals and celebrations provided opportunities for social bonding across family and social lines. Harvest festivals, religious holidays, and civic celebrations brought entire communities together for shared experiences that reinforced collective identity and values. Conflict resolution mechanisms were essential for maintaining community harmony despite the potential for disputes over property, trade, family matters, and personal conflicts. Communities developed formal and informal procedures for addressing conflicts that emphasized restoration of social relationships rather than punishment. Courtship, marriage, and family formation. Courtship and marriage practices in colonial America reflected both practical considerations and romantic aspirations, creating institutions that balanced individual desires with family and community interests. These practices varied by region, social class, and religious affiliation but shared common patterns and purposes. Parental involvement in mate selection was extensive, particularly among wealthy families where marriage decisions affected property inheritance and social alliances. Parents might arrange introductions, supervise courtship activities, and exercise veto power over unsuitable matches. However, forced marriages were relatively rare, and most young people had some voice in their marriage decisions. Economic considerations played major roles in marriage decisions, as families sought partners who could contribute to economic security and advancement. Men needed sufficient resources to support families, while women's domestic skills and potential inheritance were important factors. These economic considerations were practical necessities rather than purely mercenary calculations. Courtship practices allowed young people to become acquainted while maintaining proper supervision and moral standards. Bundling, a practice where courting couples shared a bed while fully clothed and separated by a bundling board, provided intimacy while theoretically preventing sexual contact. This practice was controversial but apparently common in some areas. Church approval was important for marriages in most colonial communities, with ministers performing ceremonies and maintaining marriage records. However, civil ceremonies were also recognized, and some couples married themselves through simple declarations of intent. The absence of rigid bureaucratic requirements made marriage accessible to most couples. Wedding ceremonies varied in elaborateness depending on the family's wealth and social position. Wealthy families might host elaborate celebrations with extensive feasting and entertainment, while poorer couples might have simple ceremonies followed by modest celebrations. However, most colonial weddings involved community participation and celebration. Marriage age varied by region and social class but generally occurred in the early 20s for both men and women. Women typically married slightly younger than men, reflecting their earlier assumption of adult responsibilities. However, colonial marriage ages were higher than in many other societies, partly due to the need for economic preparation. Premarital pregnancy occurred in a significant minority of colonial marriages, suggesting that courtship sometimes included sexual relationships despite religious and social prohibitions. However, most premarital pregnancies resulted in marriage, indicating community pressure to legitimize these relationships. Interracial marriage was legally prohibited in most colonies and socially condemned throughout colonial America. However, informal relationships between people of different races did occur, particularly between white men and African or Native American women. Children from these relationships often faced significant social and legal disadvantages. Marriage dissolution was extremely difficult in colonial America, with formal divorce available only in limited circumstances and only in some jurisdictions. Separation was more common than divorce, though it left both parties unable to remarry legally. These restrictions meant that most marriages continued until ended by death. Remarriage was common and generally accepted, particularly for widowed individuals who needed economic support and companionship. Remarriage often created complex family relationships involving step-parents, stepchildren, and half-siblings. These blended families were common features of colonial society due to high mortality rates. Child-rearing and family relationships. Colonial child-rearing practices reflected beliefs about human nature, social responsibility, and practical necessities that shaped family relationships and community values. These practices varied among social classes and religious groups but shared common elements that distinguished colonial childhood from modern experiences. Children were viewed as small adults who needed moral guidance and practical training rather than extended periods of play and exploration. This perspective influenced expectations about children's behavior, responsibilities, and contributions to family welfare. However, colonial parents were not without affection for their children and recognized their special needs and vulnerabilities. Parental authority was extensive and rarely questioned, reflecting religious beliefs about family hierarchy and social needs for order and discipline. Fathers held ultimate authority over children's education, marriage, and career choices, though mothers exercised considerable influence over daily child care and moral instruction. Physical discipline was considered necessary and appropriate for teaching children proper behavior and moral values. Corporal punishment was common in both homes and schools, justified by religious beliefs about the need to suppress sinful human nature. However, excessive or cruel punishment was generally condemned. Children's work contributions were essential to family survival and economic success. Children began simple tasks at young ages and gradually assumed more complex responsibilities as they matured. This work was viewed as educational and character-building rather than merely exploitative. Educational expectations varied dramatically by social class and gender. Wealthy boys might receive extensive formal education preparing them for professional careers, while poor children might receive minimal schooling. Girls' education typically focused on domestic skills rather than academic subjects, though basic literacy was increasingly valued. Play and recreation were limited compared to modern childhood experiences but were not entirely absent. Children created games and toys from available materials and found entertainment in community celebrations and seasonal activities. However, productive work took priority over recreational activities. Coming-of-age rituals were less formal than in many societies but included transitions like apprenticeship placement, religious confirmation, and assumption of adult responsibilities. These transitions marked children's progress toward independent adult status and community recognition. Parent-child relationships often remained close throughout life, with adult children maintaining strong ties to parents and extended family. These relationships provided emotional support and practical assistance that were crucial for survival and success in colonial society. Sibling relationships were shaped by large family sizes, shared responsibilities, and inheritance patterns. Older children often helped care for younger siblings, creating bonds that continued into adulthood. However, inheritance competition could also create tensions among siblings. Child mortality had profound effects on family relationships and parenting practices. Parents developed emotional strategies for coping with frequent loss while maintaining investment in surviving children. These experiences influenced attitudes toward life, death, and spiritual faith that characterized colonial culture. Leisure, entertainment, and recreation. Colonial leisure activities reflected both European traditions and American adaptations, providing entertainment and social bonding opportunities while reinforcing community values and relationships. These activities varied by region, social class, and religious attitudes but shared common functions in colonial society. Religious restrictions limited some forms of entertainment, particularly in Puritan New England where dancing, theater, and games were sometimes prohibited or discouraged. However, most communities found ways to incorporate recreation into their lives while maintaining religious respectability. Seasonal celebrations provided major recreational opportunities that brought communities together for shared enjoyment. Harvest festivals, Christmas celebrations, where permitted, and civic holidays featured feasting, music, dancing, and games that strengthened community bonds and provided relief from daily work. Music and dancing were popular recreational activities despite occasional religious opposition. Community gatherings often featured singing, instrumental music, and folk dancing that preserved cultural traditions while providing social entertainment. Musical instruments were prized possessions that enhanced family and community celebrations. Storytelling was an important form of entertainment that preserved cultural traditions and provided education as well as amusement. Oral traditions included folk tales, historical accounts, and moral stories that transmitted values and knowledge across generations. Games and sports provided physical recreation and competitive entertainment for people of all ages. Common activities included card games, board games, races, wrestling matches, and ball games. These activities often involved betting and considerable community interest. Taverns served as important recreational centers in colonial communities, providing food, drink, and social interaction for travelers and local residents. Tavern activities included gambling, political discussion, and entertainment that made these establishments focal points of community social life. Reading became increasingly important as a recreational activity as literacy rates increased and printed materials became more available. Newspapers, books, and pamphlets provided entertainment as well as information, contributing to the development of colonial intellectual culture. Hunting and fishing served both practical and recreational purposes, providing food while offering sport and social interaction. These activities were particularly important in frontier areas where wild game supplemented domestic food production. Colonial fairs and markets combined economic and recreational functions, providing opportunities for trade while offering entertainment through competitions, performances, and social interaction. These events often drew people from wide geographical areas and strengthened regional relationships. Visiting and social calling were important recreational activities that maintained family and community relationships. These visits often involved elaborate preparations and formal protocols that demonstrated social status while providing opportunities for conversation and companionship. Artisan crafts sometimes served recreational purposes as well as practical ones, with activities like quilting, wood carving, and metalworking providing creative outlets and social interaction. Craft competitions and exhibitions allowed artisans to display their skills while entertaining community audiences. Community festivals and celebrations. Colonial celebrations reflected the complex interplay between religious beliefs, cultural traditions, and community needs that characterized colonial society. These events provided opportunities for social bonding, cultural expression, and temporary suspension of daily routines and social restrictions. Religious holidays formed the backbone of colonial celebration calendars, though observance practices varied significantly among denominations and regions. Christmas was celebrated in some colonies but banned in others due to religious objections to its perceived popish origins. Easter, Thanksgiving, and various saints' days provided other occasions for religious observance and community celebration. Harvest festivals were among the most important secular celebrations, marking the successful completion of agricultural cycles that determined community survival and prosperity. These celebrations featured feasting, music, dancing, and games that brought entire communities together for shared enjoyment and mutual congratulation. Election days often became community festivals that combined civic responsibility with recreational activities. Candidates provided food and drink for voters, while communities used the occasion for socializing, political discussion, and entertainment that made these events social highlights. Military celebrations commemorated important battles, victories, or military service that had significance for particular communities. Training days for colonial militias often included competitive exercises, feasting, and entertainment that strengthened community bonds while maintaining military preparedness. Wedding celebrations varied in elaborateness but typically involved community participation that extended beyond immediate families. These events often included multiple days of activities featuring feasting, music, dancing, and games that strengthened social networks and celebrated family alliances. Colonial fairs combined economic and recreational functions, providing markets for goods while offering entertainment through competitions, performances, and social activities. These events often drew participants from wide geographical areas and facilitated regional economic and social relationships. Seasonal celebrations marked important transitions in the agricultural and social calendar. May Day celebrations, midsummer festivals, and winter solstice observances provided opportunities for community bonding while maintaining connections to European cultural traditions. Craft competitions and exhibitions allowed artisans to display their skills while providing entertainment for community audiences. These events encouraged excellence in traditional crafts while preserving cultural knowledge and techniques that were essential for colonial life. Coming-of-age ceremonies and celebrations marked important transitions in individual lives while reinforcing community values and social structures. These events might include religious confirmations, apprenticeship placements, or marriage celebrations that recognized individual achievements within community contexts. Colonial celebrations often included elements that would later be considered inappropriate or offensive, including activities that reinforced racial, gender, or social hierarchies. However, these events also provided opportunities for temporary suspension of normal social restrictions and expressions of community solidarity that transcended some social divisions. New England, Puritan society and commercial development. New England's distinctive character was shaped by Puritan religious culture, harsh environmental conditions, and gradual evolution toward commercial capitalism. This region developed unique social institutions and cultural patterns that profoundly influenced American development while maintaining strong connections to English traditions. The Puritan migration of the 1630s established the fundamental character of New England society, emphasizing religious devotion, community organization, and moral discipline. These settlers created city upon a hill, communities designed to demonstrate Christian virtues to the world while providing religious freedom for themselves. Town organization reflected Puritan values and practical necessities, creating nucleated settlements centered around meetinghouses that served both religious and governmental functions. These towns were typically planned communities with house lots, farming areas, and common lands allocated according to family size and social standing. Economic development in New England was constrained by poor soil and harsh climate but encouraged by abundant forests, waterways, and coastal location. Agriculture remained primarily subsistence farming supplemented by livestock raising, while forestry provided lumber for local use and export. Maritime activities became increasingly important to New England's economy, including fishing, whaling, and shipbuilding industries that took advantage of the region's natural resources and geographical position. These activities created wealth that supported further economic development and cultural sophistication. Manufacturing developed earlier in New England than in other regions, beginning with textile production and expanding to include metalworking, rum distilling, and various craft industries. The region's limited agricultural potential encouraged diversification into commercial and manufacturing activities. Educational institutions reflected Puritan emphasis on literacy and learning, creating the most extensive school system in colonial America. Harvard College, 1636, was followed by Yale, 1701, and other institutions that trained ministers and other educated professionals who shaped New England culture. Social hierarchy in New England was based more on religious standing and educational achievement than on landed wealth, though economic success was certainly valued. The Puritan elect held privileged positions, while social mobility was possible through religious conversion, education, or commercial success. Women in New England had somewhat greater legal protections and social recognition than in other regions, though they remained subordinate to male authority. Puritan theology emphasized women's spiritual equality while maintaining traditional gender roles in family and community life. Cultural life in New England emphasized intellectual and spiritual pursuits over material display or recreational activities. Reading, religious discussion, and moral improvement were valued over entertainment or artistic expression, though these restrictions relaxed somewhat over time. By the mid-18th century, New England was experiencing significant social and cultural changes as commercial development, population growth, and Enlightenment ideas challenged traditional Puritan values and institutions. These changes would contribute to the region's leadership in revolutionary activities. The Middle Colonies, diversity and tolerance. The Middle Colonies developed the most diverse and tolerant society in colonial America, attracting immigrants from various European countries and religious backgrounds. This region's character was shaped by cultural pluralism, religious tolerance, and economic opportunity that created unique social and political institutions. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn as a Quaker colony, established the pattern of religious tolerance and cultural diversity that characterized the region. Penn's policies attracted German, Scots-Irish, and other immigrant groups who created a mosaic of languages, religions, and cultural traditions. German immigration was particularly significant in Pennsylvania, where religious groups like Mennonites, Amish, Moravians, and Lutherans established distinct communities while contributing to the region's agricultural and craft development. These groups maintained their languages and customs while adapting to American conditions. Scots-Irish immigrants brought Presbyterian traditions and frontier skills that proved valuable in backcountry settlement and defense. These immigrants often served as intermediaries between established coastal communities and frontier areas, contributing to westward expansion. Dutch influence remained strong in New York despite English conquest in 1664, with Dutch families maintaining their language, customs, and economic dominance for several generations. The patroon system created large estates along the Hudson River that resembled European feudal arrangements. Religious diversity in the Middle Colonies included virtually every Christian denomination plus small Jewish communities in cities like New York and Philadelphia. This diversity required practical tolerance and cooperation that contrasted sharply with religious uniformity in other regions. Economic development in the Middle Colonies benefited from fertile soil, favorable climate, and excellent river systems that facilitated transportation and commerce. The region became known as the breadbasket of colonial America due to its wheat production and grain exports. Philadelphia emerged as the largest and most sophisticated city in colonial America, serving as a commercial and cultural center that rivaled Boston and New York. The city's planned layout, cultural institutions, and commercial development reflected Enlightenment ideas about urban planning and social progress. Slavery existed in the Middle Colonies but was less central to the economy than in the South. Most slaves worked as domestic servants, artisans, or laborers rather than agricultural workers, and gradual emancipation movements began earlier in this region than elsewhere. Political institutions in the Middle Colonies reflected the region's diversity and relatively democratic character. Pennsylvania's frame of government provided for religious liberty and representative government, while New York's political system evolved from Dutch to English models with some democratic innovations. Cultural life in the Middle Colonies emphasized practical achievement and material prosperity over religious or intellectual pursuits. The region produced many of colonial America's most successful merchants, artisans, and inventors while maintaining tolerance for various cultural expressions. By the Revolutionary period, the Middle Colonies had developed distinctive American characteristics that combined European influences with New World innovations. This region's experience with diversity and tolerance would prove influential in shaping American national identity and institutions. The Chesapeake, tobacco culture and social hierarchy. The Chesapeake region, comprising Virginia and Maryland, developed a distinctive plantation society based on tobacco cultivation, slave labor, and sharp social hierarchies. This region's character was shaped by the economic opportunities and social challenges created by successful staple crop agriculture. Tobacco cultivation transformed the Chesapeake from a struggling frontier region to a prosperous society that generated enormous wealth for successful planters. The crop's profitability attracted both investment and immigration while creating demand for labor that was initially met by indentured servants and later by enslaved Africans. The plantation system created dispersed settlement patterns that contrasted sharply with New England's nucleated towns. Great planters built impressive houses on large estates along rivers that provided transportation for their crops and imported goods, while smaller farmers scattered throughout the interior areas. Social hierarchy in the Chesapeake was more pronounced than in other regions, with a small planter elite dominating society, politics, and culture. These families accumulated vast wealth and extensive landholdings that provided the foundation for political power and social influence. The planter elite developed a distinctive culture that emphasized hospitality, leisure activities, and conspicuous consumption that demonstrated their wealth and status. Horse racing, cockfighting, dancing, and elaborate entertaining became important social activities that reinforced class distinctions. Slavery became central to Chesapeake society and economy as tobacco cultivation expanded during the 17th and 18th centuries. The transition from indentured to slave labor occurred gradually but fundamentally altered the region's social structure and cultural characteristics. The experiences of enslaved people in the Chesapeake varied depending on the size of plantations, the attitudes of owners, and the types of work they performed. Large plantations developed distinctive slave communities with their own social hierarchies, cultural practices, and survival strategies. Poor whites in the Chesapeake occupied a precarious social position between the planter elite and enslaved population. These individuals often struggled for economic advancement and social recognition while maintaining their freedom and potential for upward mobility. Women in Chesapeake society faced restrictions similar to those in other regions but with some variations related to the plantation system. Planter wives had extensive household responsibilities managing large estates, while poor women often worked alongside their husbands in agricultural labor. Religious life in the Chesapeake was dominated by the established Anglican Church, though actual religious observance was often less rigorous than in New England. The dispersed settlement pattern made regular church attendance difficult, leading to more individualistic and less institutional religious practices. Economic relationships in the Chesapeake were characterized by extensive credit networks that connected small farmers to merchants and planters. These relationships created dependencies that reinforced social hierarchies while facilitating commercial development. Political institutions in the Chesapeake reflected planter dominance while providing some opportunities for broader participation. The House of Burgesses in Virginia and similar institutions in Maryland gave colonists experience with representative government while maintaining elite control. The Lower South: rice, indigo, and plantation society. The Lower South, including South Carolina and Georgia, developed plantation societies based on rice and indigo cultivation that created unique social and economic characteristics. This region's development was influenced by Caribbean models and West African expertise that shaped both agricultural practices and social relationships. Rice cultivation in coastal South Carolina succeeded largely due to the knowledge and skills of enslaved West Africans who understood rice-growing techniques that European colonists lacked. This agricultural success created prosperity while establishing patterns of racial exploitation and cultural exchange. Indigo cultivation, promoted by Eliza Lucas Pinckney in the 1740s, provided a second cash crop that complemented rice production and increased the region's economic diversification. Indigo cultivation required different skills and timing than rice, creating year-round agricultural activities. Charleston emerged as the cultural and commercial center of the Lower South, developing sophisticated urban culture that combined English, West African, and Caribbean influences. The city's architecture, cuisine, and social customs reflected this cultural mixing while maintaining rigid racial hierarchies. The task system used on Lower South plantations differed from the gang labor system common in the Chesapeake, allowing enslaved people more autonomy in organizing their work while meeting production quotas. This system created opportunities for enslaved people to develop their own economic activities and cultural practices. Gullah culture developed among enslaved people in the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country, combining West African traditions with American experiences to create distinctive language, customs, and social practices that persisted for generations. The planter elite in the Lower South developed perhaps the most aristocratic culture in colonial America, emphasizing education, refinement, and connections to English society. Many planters sent their children to England for education and maintained cultural ties to European intellectual and social developments. Urban slavery was particularly important in Charleston, where enslaved people worked as artisans, domestics, and laborers who developed skills and earned money that provided some opportunities for advancement. The city's slave markets also made it a center of the domestic slave trade. Native American relationships were crucial in the Lower South, where colonial expansion created conflicts with Creek, Cherokee, and other indigenous peoples. These relationships involved both warfare and trade that affected the region's development and security. Women in the Lower South faced restrictions similar to those in other regions but with some distinctive features related to the plantation system and urban development. Elite women managed large households and sometimes plantations, overseeing numerous enslaved workers and complex domestic operations. Some women like Eliza Lucas Pinckney played important roles in agricultural innovation and economic development. Religious life in the Lower South was dominated by the Anglican Church, though the region's cultural diversity and economic focus meant that religious observance was often less central than in New England. The influence of West African spiritual traditions among enslaved populations created syncretic religious practices that blended Christian and traditional African elements. Georgia's development differed somewhat from South Carolina due to its later founding, 1733, and initial prohibition of slavery. The colony was established as a refuge for debtors and a buffer against Spanish Florida, But economic pressures led to the introduction of slavery and the development of plantation agriculture similar to South Carolina. By the Revolutionary period, the Lower South had developed one of the most stratified societies in colonial America, with enormous wealth concentrated among a small planter elite while the majority of the population, both enslaved and free, lived in poverty or dependency. This social structure would profoundly influence the region's role in the American Revolution and subsequent national development. The colonial backcountry, stretching along the Appalachian foothills from Pennsylvania to Georgia, developed distinctive characteristics that differed significantly from established coastal societies. This region attracted diverse immigrant groups and created new patterns of social organization adapted to frontier conditions. Scots-Irish immigrants were particularly numerous in the backcountry, bringing Presbyterian religious traditions, clan-based social organization, and experience with frontier warfare. These immigrants often served as intermediaries between coastal settlements and Native American territories, developing skills in diplomacy and warfare that proved essential for frontier survival. German immigrants also settled extensively in backcountry areas, particularly in Pennsylvania and the Carolinas. These settlers often maintained their language and customs while adapting their agricultural and craft skills to American conditions. Their emphasis on industry and material accumulation contributed significantly to backcountry economic development. Native American relationships were more complex and immediate in the backcountry than in coastal areas, involving both cooperation and conflict as different groups competed for land and resources. Trade relationships provided mutual benefits, while territorial expansion created tensions that sometimes erupted into warfare. Social organization in the backcountry was less hierarchical than in coastal areas, with greater emphasis on individual achievement and practical skills rather than inherited status or formal education. However, racial hierarchies remained important, and conflicts over land and labor created social tensions. Economic activities in the backcountry combined subsistence agriculture with commercial ventures like livestock raising, fur trading, and whiskey production. The absence of navigable rivers and good roads made transportation difficult, encouraging the development of products that could be easily moved to distant markets. Religious life in the backcountry was influenced by the Great Awakening and evangelical movements that emphasized personal religious experience over formal institutional authority. Presbyterian, Baptist, and Methodist churches provided important social institutions that helped organize communities and maintain moral standards. Violence was more common in backcountry areas due to conflicts with Native Americans, disputes over land claims, and the absence of effective law enforcement. Vigilante groups and informal justice systems developed to maintain order when formal legal institutions were inadequate or absent. Cultural mixing in the backcountry created new American cultural patterns that combined European traditions with frontier innovations. Music, food, crafts, and social customs evolved through interaction among different ethnic groups and adaptation to American conditions. Women in backcountry areas often had greater practical equality with men due to the demands of frontier life, though legal and social restrictions remained. Women's skills in household production, medical care, and agriculture were essential for family survival and community development. The backcountry's experience with cultural diversity, individual achievement, and democratic participation would prove influential in American national development, contributing to ideals of equality and opportunity that distinguished American society from European models. The 170 years of colonial American history created the foundations for what would become the United States, establishing patterns of social organization, economic development, and cultural expression that would influence the nation's subsequent evolution. Understanding how people actually lived during this period reveals both the achievements and limitations of colonial society while explaining the origins of distinctively American characteristics. Colonial Americans created a society that was simultaneously traditional and innovative, maintaining strong connections to European heritage while adapting to New World conditions and opportunities. This process of adaptation occurred across all aspects of life, from housing and agriculture to social relationships and religious practices, creating new American forms that drew from multiple traditions. The diversity of colonial society was one of its most distinctive characteristics, encompassing regional variations, ethnic differences, religious diversity, and economic differentiation that created a complex social mosaic. This diversity required practical tolerance and cooperation that would prove essential for creating a unified nation from distinct colonial societies. Economic development during the colonial period established patterns of growth and innovation that would characterize American capitalism. The evolution from subsistence agriculture to commercial farming, manufacturing, and international trade created economic institutions and attitudes that supported later industrial development. Social hierarchies in colonial America were significant but less rigid than in European societies, allowing for social mobility while maintaining important distinctions based on wealth, race, gender, and social status. These hierarchies created both opportunities and limitations that influenced individual lives and community development. The colonial experience with self-governance provided essential preparation for independence and nation-building. Colonial assemblies, town meetings, and local institutions gave colonists extensive experience with democratic participation and representative government that distinguished American political culture from European models. Cultural achievements in colonial America included distinctive developments in architecture, crafts, literature, and intellectual life that demonstrated growing American confidence and creativity. While colonial culture remained heavily influenced by European models, it also developed characteristics that reflected American experiences and conditions. The moral contradictions of colonial society, particularly regarding slavery and treatment of indigenous peoples, created tensions that would persist throughout American history. Colonial society's simultaneous commitment to liberty and maintenance of oppressive institutions revealed fundamental contradictions that would require resolution through later political and social developments. Religious diversity and the gradual development of religious tolerance established important precedents for American principles of religious freedom. While most colonial societies maintained religious establishments, the practical necessity of accommodating diverse religious groups created experiences with tolerance that influenced later constitutional provisions. The colonial period's most important legacy may have been the creation of a distinctively American identity that combined European heritage with New World innovations. This identity emphasized individual opportunity, democratic participation, religious freedom, and economic advancement while maintaining social order and cultural continuity. Colonial Americans' daily struggles with survival, community building, and cultural adaptation created resilience and innovation that would prove essential during the Revolutionary Crisis and early national period. Their experiences with diversity, self-governance, and adaptation to changing conditions provided crucial preparation for the challenges of independence and nation-building. The story of how people actually lived in colonial America reveals a society that was far more complex, diverse, and dynamic than simplified historical narratives suggest. These colonial experiences created the human foundations upon which the American nation would be built, establishing patterns of life and thought that continue to influence American society today. Understanding colonial life in its full complexity helps explain both the achievements and failures of American society while providing perspective on the ongoing process of creating unity from diversity that has characterized the American experience from its earliest beginnings. The colonial period was not merely a prelude to American independence, but a formative era that established enduring patterns of American life and culture.